Western University. Today we are looking at chapter 3, which is authentication, authorization, and accounting. Okay, in networks and cybersecurity. So, without much ado, let's begin. Here we're looking, first and foremost, we're looking at the managing administrative access. How do we manage administrative access? Who is supposed to have an administrative access? Who is supposed to have the ordinary user access? So to managing administrative access infrastructure is very, very important because that's the only way we'll be able to monitor authorization and the use of the system. Otherwise, people will abuse the system and have access to what they're not supposed to have access to. So a network must be designed to control who is allowed to connect to it and what they're supposed to do when they connect to the network, and what they're supposed to do when they connect to this network. So we must give access, as it were, to people, authorizations to people based on the job that they're doing. If you're an IT, your authorization, your access, administrative access is quite different from someone who is just an ordinary user in the organization. Now, what are the methods that we use to give access to people? Number one method is using password. Number one method is to use the password only. Number two is to use what we call the local database method. Number three is using AAA local authorization. AAA local authentication, which is called the self-contained AAA, AAA. And this AAA is actually authentication, authorization, and accounting. That's what the AAA stands for. Number four method that can be used to create different access to people based on in order to protect the network or secure the network. The fourth method is a AAA server-based method. Is that okay? Now let's quickly take a look at this method or the type of asset that can be granted to users in the network and the mode with which this access can be granted, and the network access server port that these people have access to, and the common AAA command elements. Now, first of all, we have two types of access. Access type, we have two. We have the remote administrative access, the first one, and the second one, we have the remote network access. Okay, remote administrative access and remote network access. So you may have access to the network, but you may not have administrative privileges. Okay, so the remote administrative access, the mode is usually the character mode. That's the line or execute mode. Okay, because you configure, and so on and so forth. So you have this mode of access. And then usually your network access port or your server port usually includes your TTY, VTY, the virtual terminal. Then you have the auxiliary, and then you have the cursor. So as a remote administrative access, or as someone with remote administrative access, you have access to your ports should include TTY, VTY, your virtual terminal port, and your auxiliary and your cursor. You should have access to all of this, okay? Because you're using them to config and to config whatever you need to configure as admin of the network, administrative analyst or administrative staff of an organization. Then the common AA mode or command element includes the login, execute, and enable commands. You have a login command, you have execute commands so that you can configure, and you have the enable command in order to keep it run. Okay, so this second type of access is the remote network access. So this one, the mode is usually the packets. These are the normal users. The packet, that's the interface mode. You just have the interface mode where you interact, where you just work on the system, not as an administrative staff. Now, your network access server point usually is a dial-up and VPN access that includes whether asynchronous and ISDN type. Okay, so it's your network access port, usually the dial-up and VPN. Okay, usually the dial-up and VPN access. Okay, that's what you have. Okay, you don't have the VTY, TTY, auxiliary, the cursor, because you are not an IT staff. You're not configuring anything, so you don't have this access. Your access is just to work on the network, to do something, maybe as a staff of an organization. just to do something, just to enter key values and so on and so forth. But you are not the one that is granting access and privileges to others. So your access is limited, okay, only to that network. Then the command line, usually you use your PPP transmission, the protocol that you use, and the network commands. That's all you have access to. Now let's take a look at the password only, method one. We say there are about 4 methods that we can use to grant access to people in an organization, work in an organization. The first method is password only method, using the password. Here you have your Ethernet here, and then you have your router. So we configure the password. First of all, we configure in the command line interface. We go to our command line interface using our execute mode or the privileged execute mode. Either we use the execute mode only, or use the privileged execute mode, depending on what you're creating and who you're creating it for. So here in the command line interface, you enter router 1. Let's assume this is your router 1. Router 1 config hashtag line VTY, the virtual terminal 04, okay, 0 to 4. These are your terminal that you have in the router, virtual terminal 04. Then you continue the configuration. Router 1 config line hashtag password Cisco. So you're going to configure your password, okay, for the router. Then router 1 config line hashtag login. You configure your login, your username and password, okay, you configure your login details. So this is done in using your user execute mode or your privileged execute mode. Password access is limited and it does not scale well. So the user execute mode or your privileged execute mode password access is usually limited, because what you have is not what others have in an organization. What you have is not what other people have in an organization. So this execute mode or privileged execute mode password, they are limited to those who have access to configure the router or to configure the server, to configure the router, the server, the switches, and all of the things in your network, okay, all your network devices. Those who have this mode or this access will automatically be able to configure things. Okay, still the second method is the local database method. The local database method that we also use to create access, different type of access for people or for administrative accesses in an organization. Okay, here we configure by going to our command line interface by writing router 1 config hashtag the username, administrative secret, and password. Okay, username, the username is admin. You put admin for your username. So this is what you do when you're using your local database method. You say router 1 config hashtag username admin. In your case, whatever you're using for your username, you write it here. In this case, admin. Secret means password. Then look at the password that we have entered for this case. Okay, strong password. But if you look, we mix numbers and letters together to write strong. In place of S, we put 5. In place of O, we put 0. Okay, so that we can mix it up and make it a strong password, to make it a strong password. Okay, so router 1 config hashtag username admin secret password. Secret, you put the password that you want to enter. Then you go to the next one. You have to configure the cursors and the ports. So router 1 config hashtag line virtual terminal 04. Router 1 config dash line hashtag login local. Okay, so this is what you do for your database method, for your local database method, login local database method. So this method provides greater security than the password one. The password one, the first one is the simple password one, but this method is more secure, provide better security compared to using the password only. So, and we say it is also cost effective. It's not so costly and easily implemented security solution. So it's not so complicated and it's not so expensive to use this method. Okay, so the next one is still on the local database method. Let's take a look at the disadvantage that will make us go for the third case solution. Now, one of the big disadvantages we have when we are using the local database, since we've itemized the advantage in it previously, we say it's a simple case, it's more secure than the password one, and it's cost effective and it can be easily implemented as a solution for for authentication and access privileges. So now, in the disadvantage that is inherent here is that configuration has to be replicated on several devices. So, like every device, you have to keep doing it manually. You have to keep configuring every of the single device. So, if the network is big, you're going to like manually be doing a lot of configuration on the system. So, a better scalable solution is for us to use what we call the AAA, the Authentication, Authorization, Accounting method. Okay, so because of this disadvantage, we opt for the third option, the third option, which is the authentication, authorization, and accounting method. Okay, now if you look at it, authentication, authorization, and accounting. So identity service. So whatever you want to do, we have is a way of using this third method, which is authentication, authorization. Now let's take a look at authentication, authorization, and accounting security services. Let's take a look at the framework, what it covers. AAA is an architectural framework for configuring what? One, you configure the authentication. What is authentication? Authentication is who is allowed access. Who are you granting the access? So you are authenticating the person, the username and password of the person, probably. So who is allowed access? Who are you granting access? Is he an ordinary user in an organization or in a network? Or is it the administrative access you are granting? So who is being allowed? That's for authentication. Authorization is what are they allowed to do? You are okay. Who is being allowed, and what privileges are they given? What are they allowed to do? Are they allowed to have access to everything in the organization? What is the limit? What are they allowed to do? So that's authorization. You have to give permission, like permission for them to do certain transaction or to do certain operations in the organization. Then account is what did they do when you granted them the access? What did they do? Like the record, what is being done. That's the accounting, the recording, the reporting of what is being done in the system, in the network, is the accounting in this regard. So this AAA method outstands the local database method and the password only method, okay, of granting access to users in the network. Now let's take a look at the AAA security service. First of all, let's use a credit card or a debit card, a Visa or MasterCard, either debit or credit. Now, if you take a look at that, your 16-digit number that is on the card is the authentication. Is what tells who owns the account. Those 16-digit number on the account is the authentication. That means this card has been authenticated through a designated user, a specific person, right? By the bank, has been given by the bank to a specific account. So that's the authentication. That's who you are. The authorization is how much can you spend. For example, limit. Like authorization, you have your daily limit, for example, your daily limit of amount you can spend. For example, that's your authorization. If you want to spend above that or you want to use above that, you have to take permission from the bank. You have to take higher authority. You have to take higher authorization. Okay, in order to spend more than that. We just use it as a case study, like to explain this authentication, authorization, and the accounting. So authentication is the 16-digit number on your Visa card. Okay, the authorization is how much limit you have to spend. Okay, your limit. Then your account is what did you spend it on? What did you spend it on? Like a feedback. What did you use it for? What did you spend the money on? That's your accounting. Okay, this is what this AAA security service stands for. Now let's take a look at the use of this AAA authentication method. So this is the third method, right? The third method, the AAA authentication method. That's the third method. Now let's take a look at it holistically. How this method outweigh the first two or outclass the first two, the password only and the local database method only. So this AAA authentication method outclass the first two. Now let's take a look at it briefly and why it's better than the first two. Now Cisco iOS router skin can implement a AAA using either the following. Can implement AAA either using local username and password database. Okay, in the case of local user, username and password database, the username and password are set in the local database of the device, okay, of the device that you're using, or of the remote client, okay, either of the device you're using or the remote client computer that you're using. Okay, so the username and password are already set in the local database of that client. That's one way. Another way is the Cisco Secure Access Control Server, ACS. Cisco Access Control Server is the big deal. A Cisco Secure Access Control Server. So it's either they use local username and password database, or they use Cisco Secure Access Control Server, ACS. So in this case, for this second way of this AAA method, authentication method, this second case, which is ACS, username and password are created and they are kept in the separate server. They are not in the remote client's computer. This username and password, they are kept in a secure server, Cisco server called ACS server. So they are created and stored here. Okay, so this is the difference. The first one, they just need the user, the client, the username and password are in this client's computer. So it just notify the router, and then the router give feedback that you can use, then it uses. But in this case, it gives, as the router establish connection with the server give a feedback to the router, and router tells you yes, grants you an access. Okay, so this is the difference. Well, so we have two scenarios: the local username and password database for AAA authentication method, or in AAA authentication method, we use the Cisco Secure Access Control Server. So any of these methods, we're going to describe these two methods as we go down. Now let's take a look at the AAA local authentication. In the case of this one, local authentication. Okay. It is also called the self-contained AAA. Okay, and provides the method of identifying user, and this method includes identify user, includes their login details, their password dialog, their challenge, the response they get, or the feedback that they get, the messaging, the support, whatever technical details that goes with this. Okay, so this is for the local user, and it's also configured by defining the name list of the authentication method. You must define the name list, okay, the named list of all the authentication that you're using, and also applying that list to various interfaces, applying to all the interfaces that you're going to be configuring that name list. You apply it to your interfaces, your cursors, like in your interface, like your cursor, your auxiliary, your VTY, the virtual terminal, and your TTY, and so on and so forth. So you're going to apply it, your name list, to all of this. Now, the only exception is the default method list. Okay, the only exception is the default method list. That's the default. The default, which is automatically applied to all the interfaces if no other method list is defined. So if there's no definition of any other method that should be used, then the default list will apply to all the interfaces. We apply to all the interfaces, whether it's the cursor, the auxiliary, the VTY, the virtual terminal, the TTY, and so on and so forth. The default setting or the default method or default method list we apply to all terminals. Is that okay? Now, still on the local authentication, AAA local authentication, the name or the default authentication method defines the type of authentication to be performed and the sequence in which they will be performed. The type of authentication that will be performed by a name list or a default list, and the sequence in which this is going to take place. Now, it must be applied to a specific interface before any of the defined authentication method will be performed. So the name list must be applied to the interfaces before any other job will be performed. Now let's take a look at AAA local authentication. AAA local authentication. Still on the AAA local authentication, the client establishes a connection. If we want to authenticate, this is how it's being done. The client establishes a connection with the router. Here is the client, remote client. Okay, he first of all establish a connection with the router, AAA router. Okay, these are provided by Cisco. Okay, that's the first way. The second case scenario is that the AAA router, prompts the user for a username and password. So the router, after you establish a connection with the router will ask you for your username and password. That's step 2. We ask you for the username and password. So you have to key in the username and password, and then the router will not say something whether or not you are granted access. Now the router authenticates the username and password using the local database, and the user is authorized to access the network based on the information that the router found on the local database, based on the information the router has on the local database of this client. So, and then you are granted access. So this method is very secure. It's better than the first 2 methods that we've described previously. Now let's take a look at server-based AAA authentication. Server-based. Now in this case, is not AAA local authentication, but it's server-based. Because local authentication is you're dealing with the router only. For local authentication, AAA local authentication, you're dealing with the router to grant you access. But in the server-based AAA authentication, you're not dealing just only with the router, you are also dealing with the server. You're also dealing with the server, what we call the Cisco Access Control Server. You're dealing with the ACS. You're dealing with the ACS, okay, as well as the router. So in this case, the server-based AAA authentication using Cisco ACS is the most scalable because all the infrastructure devices access a central server. So the Cisco ACN is very scalable. It can take multiple groups. You can assign group access. You can do group configuration, group access, and so on and so forth. So it's very scalable. It's very good. So using the server-based AAA authentication is superb to use. Okay. Now here is the deal, or here is the catch. Now fault tolerant because multiple ACS can be configured. It's fault tolerant because you can configure more than so many access at the same time. Okay, you can configure so many access at the same time. There is also, since it's multiple, you can do for so many. So it's enterprise friendly. So it's like an enterprise solution. It's enterprise friendly. Unlike the one you'll be doing manually, the method 2, the local database, which is manual, okay, or the password. So these ones are not enterprise friendly, those first 2. But this local AAA authentication, whether it's server based or it's database based, is local authentication, they are friendly. They are friendly because they're enterprise based solution. Now the actual server can be either a Cisco Secure ACS for Windows Server, or for NG, Solution NG, or Cisco Secure ACS Solution NG. So for the server, with the type of server that are available on a network, on a huge network, is either like if you're using Cisco server in this regard, okay? Because this course we are specifically looking at the Cisco NG or the Cisco server, so or the Cisco networking devices, so to say, okay, put in a broader form, we're looking at the Cisco networking devices. So it's either we're using the actual server could either be the Cisco ACS for Windows Server or ACS for Solution NG. Okay, now for Windows servers, AAA services on the router contact a Cisco Secure Access Control Server system for user and administrator authentication. So it will contact Cisco Secure ACS system for any user in the network, and also for the administrator authentication. Then if you're using it for Solution NGs, the ACS Solution NG, AAA services on the router or NAS contact an external Cisco ACS Solution NG for user and also for administrator authentication. Okay, in both cases. Now let's take a look at this server base now diagrammatically. Step 1 is that the client will establish a connection with the router. Look at the client. The client will establish a connection with the router. That's step 1 for this server-based AAA authentication. That's step 1. Step 2 is that, look at step 2 here. Step 2 is that the AAA router, this is called AAA router. The AAA router prompts the user for a username and password. After you establish a connection with them, it will say, okay, give me your username and password. Let me verify. Something like that, literally. Okay, give me your username and password and let me verify. So the AAA router, it will prompt the client for his username and password. Okay, that's step 2. Step 3, obviously, you would give your username and password. You type in your username and password. After you've done that, then we go to step 3. Step 3 is that this router authenticates the username and password using a remote AAA server. We ask this big guy, we ask the server, this Cisco Secure ACS server, is this username and password authentic? Is it correct? So if authentic, then it will grant this client, remote client access privilege to whatever he needs to do. If not, he will decline. You cannot access, you can't log in. Okay. The fourth one is that the user is authorized to access the network based on the information on the remote AAA server, based on the information that is available on the remote server. So if the server says yes, we know him, we have the details, it's correct, it's verified, then the router will grant this client server access. If not, this router will decline the request from this remote client. We decline the request. Okay, so let's move on. Now we're done with the authentication. Let's go to the second step, which is the authorization. You know, they are AAA. This chapter is about AAA: authentication, authorization, and accounting. The second phase of this is the authorization. Now, what's authorization used for? Authorization is used to provide the method for remote access control, like control technique. You can do this, you cannot do this. You have this privilege, you don't have this privilege. You cannot do this transaction. You can't do this, you don't have this. Decline, accept it. So authorization is that extra privilege access that is given to you, okay, in order to access a specific level. Now, including one-time authorization, or whether it's one-time authorization or authorization for each service per user, account list, and profile, user group, and so on and so forth. So this authorization could be one time only, could be multiple times, could be per every service, or per user, per account list, or per profile, per group, or per support, and so group support, user group support, and so on and so forth. So it depends. Authorization varies for the various usage. Now, once a user has been authenticated, authorization is the next thing to do, right? The authorization services determine which resources the user can access. Yes, which resources? Okay, if you are a fund transfer officer in a bank, you need to get authorization for certain transactions that you want to carry out. Okay, for certain transfer, local transfer, or Western Union transfer or reception, you need to get authorization from the head of operation. Okay, so authorization tells what resources you can use, or your user can access. Your user resources the user can access in a network. And then also it tells the operation the user is allowed to perform. Also, what operation you can do, what you can access, resources the user can access, and what operation the user can perform. So the authorization is so after you've been authenticated, then you be authorized. Authorization is to tell the resources that you have privileges to, and the operation the user is allowed to perform. What operation you can perform. Okay. Other than that, you'll be declined. For example, user, like if you're a student in a university or in a big network, you can only access the host server XYZ using the telnet only. Okay, you cannot do everything. You are not the admin. You are not the privileges for lecturers are different from privileges for students, and that of the lecturers are different from that of the admin. Okay, the admin. So the grant privileges are different based on the specific task that you do in an organization, in a network. So as with authentication, AAA authorization is configured by defining a name list of authorization methods and then applying that list to various interfaces. We have to define the AAA authorization. To configure a AAA authorization, you have to define a name list of authorization methods and then apply it to all your interfaces, like your IT department, your student department, your lecturer department, your whatever department. You apply it after you've had your name list. Who is this applicable to? Okay. Now let's take a look at AAA authorization now. Authorization. We're not talking about authentication. How do you get a AAA authorization? Here is the remote client. The remote client always establishes a connection has been established because it has been authenticated. So we say this remote client, which is the user, has authenticated and a session has been established to a AAA server. So it has already done authentication. You know, authentication has to come first before we talk about authorization. So this blue line is the authentication that has been established from this client to the server, to this server, to the ACS server. Now that is done. After that, then we will start the authorization process. Then we say the next step is that when the user attempts to enter privilege execute mode command, when the user wants to enter the privilege execute mode command, the router requests authorization because it's not everyone in a network that should access or prompt access the privilege execute mode. These are specifically for IT people in an organization. Okay, the programmers and the network analysts and the admin, they have the privilege execute mode. Okay, so when a client or a user requests for a privilege execute mode command, the router will request authorization from where? From this ACS server, where this AAA ACS server. Okay, the router will request. This router will ask, hey, should I grant this guy access? Should I grant this access to this, what he's asking for? Okay, we will ask the server. The AAA router will ask the server, should I grant access? Okay, to verify whether the user has the right to use what he's asking for, the privilege execute mode. So the router will ask the server, to the ACS server, to verify whether this user has the right to what is asking for. Okay, now after that, this is the message from, that's your number two. The router is asking the server, that's your number two. Is asking the server, does this guy has the right? This guy that has already been authenticated. Now I want to authorize him. Does he have the right to access the privilege execute mode? And then the server will respond. ACS server will respond to the AAA router. Will respond, and by saying the AAA server returns a pass or a fail response. So which is for this step 3. This server will return a pass or a fail. Meaning a pass means yes, he has access. Grant him access. He has what it takes. Yes. A fail means no, he does it. He does it. We don't have him in his register as someone who can access the privilege execute mode. So deny. So that's it. That's the authorization. Looking for authorization from the server. Authorization is granting you access to what you are asking for, whether you have that privilege to have what you are asking for. Now we go to the third one. You know, for this chapter we said there are 3 phases: the authentication, authorization, and accounting. Now, what is the accounting part of it? The accounting provides the method for collecting and sending security server information. Collecting all the security server information and sending all the security server information. That's accounting, okay? The detailed collection and the sending, this is called the accounting. This method is usually used for billing purposes, for DT purposes, for reporting purposes. Okay. So we say then such users identity, start and stop times, executed commands, number of packet that you've done, the bytes of the packet, the time you started, the time you stop, all the command that you've entered the packet, every T will be reported, will be displayed by a kind of a router coffee show accounting. So we will get to that. We will get to that. Okay. Now with AAA accounting activated, the router reports user activity to the TACAX Plus, and we also have another we call the radius. Okay. The AAA accounting is usually, once it's activated, the router reports the user activities to the TACAX. TACAX is actually usually the terminal access controls service or system. So TACAX plus security server in the form of accounting records. So it will send all your activity, user activity, to the TACAX is actually a protocol. Okay, for all the security details on your accounting record, on your dealings in the system. Okay, so accounting is configured by defining a name list of accounting, just like in the authorization. Okay, accounting is configured by defining a name list of accounting methods and then applying this name list to various interfaces as it were. Now let's take a look at the AAA accounting. Here is the remote client, and then he establishes, which is authentication, with the AAA router and with the ACS server. And then after that, then whatever you ask, the router will ask the server, and then if granted, we see. Now, when a user has been authenticated, authentication is this green line, will be authenticated. Okay, when a user has been authenticated, we say the AAA accounting process generates a start message to begin the accounting process. Okay, now when the user logs out, a stop message is recorded and the accounting process ends. So both cases, here is to start recording all your accounting messaging, and here is to stop. Okay, now let's move on. Now let's take a look at the AAA benefits. What the authentication, authorization, and accounting. What is their benefit? What's the benefit? What's the benefit? Number one is that it helps to increase flexibility and control of access configuration. It helps to increase flexibility and control of access configuration. Okay, that's the AAA. One of the advantage or benefits is the flexibility of use and the control of access configuration. Number two, scalability. If it's just password only, it's not so scalable. So when we have the AAA, it's scalable. It's an enterprise solution. It supports different enterprise network because multiple users can be configured the same time. So it's enterprise solution based. So we talk about scalability because it can be used at the same time, can be used to configure so many people on the network. Okay, scalability is one of the advantages of AAA. And then another advantage of the AAA is the multiple backup system. So there is a multiple backup system. You have authentication, you have authorization, you have accounting. So these are all different backup that can help the system in order to retrieve whatever is being lost or whatever when anything happens to the system. Then another advantage of the AAA is the standardized authentication method. The standardized authentication method, which includes the radius, the TACAX, and the Kerberos. These are standardized methods that are used, so it makes it interesting. Okay, the radius are usually used for the solution NG, and while the TACAX are used for Windows, TACAX Plus are used for Windows, and Kerberos are also used for Windows. Now let's take a look at the AAA scalability. AAA, that's authentication, authorization, and accounting. AAA is typically implemented using a dedicated access control server to store username, password in a centralized database. So what it does is to take all the username and password and be stored in a central database. Now, information is centrally entered or updated on like a local database. A local database, you have to like enter information per user, but in this case, we can centrally enter the information on the system. Okay. Now let's take a look at AAA multiple backup system. What are these backups? Multiple backups advantage that it has. Like we say, it has the radio server, it has the TACAX servers, it has the workstation, okay, it has the NAS, which is the router in this regard, it has the dial-up, and so on and so forth. So here, it's this one because of multiple backup system. There is what we call the fault tolerance, and you can configure this fault tolerance in a fallback sequence. How do you do that? First, you consult a security server. Next, if there's error or none, you consult local database. Okay, if there's error, you consult local database. So you can see we have backups. Okay, now let's move on. Still on AAA standardized security protocols. AAA supports standardized security protocols. The first one, the protocol. You remember I said earlier on that TACAX Plus and Radius, they are security protocols used by servers, used by these servers. Okay, the TACAX Plus, TACA actually stands for Terminal Access Controller or Control. It's up to you. Terminal Access Controller, Access Control System Plus. That's TACAX. Okay. So, and then we say it also replaces the legacy protocol TACAX and XTACAX. TACAX is the previous one we used to use, or XTACAX. But the TACAX Plus has replaced these two that we are used in the past. Okay, protocol. Now, another protocol is the Radius. The Radius is a remote authentication die in use service. It stands for remote authentication die in use service. That's Radius. That's what it stands for. This one is used for search engine solution. Okay. Now let's go to implementing local AAA authentication. How do we implement it? How do we configure it now? We want to go to the configuration. We're starting again from the local AAA authentication. How do we authenticate it? Okay. So we authenticate it by putting it on the command line interface. So we're looking at the command line interface. The CLI is command line interface. Okay, command line interface local authentication configuration steps. The step you need to take in order to configure this local authentication, AAA local authentication. Number one is you go to your command line interface, you go to privileged execute mode, and then or you go to user execute mode, privileged execute mode, and then you enable AAA by using the global configuration command. Okay, so when you go to this CLI, which is the command line interface, you put your AAA new model. Just key in your AAA new model. Then you define the authentication method list that you use. AAA authentication. That's what you just type. After AAA new model, you put AAA authentication. Then you apply the method list to the particular interface or line that you want to configure. Okay. Now we say enable AAA. This is the next thing. Because in the configuration process, after you enter there, you have to enable it. Then to do that, you just type the AAA new model command, enable the AAA feature. You click on that command, enable AAA. So, which is AAA command can now be configured once you do this, once you enable it. So to disable AAA, use the no AAA new model command. You type in no AAA new model. Once you type it, it will disable the AAA. Okay. Once you type the AAA new model, it will enable the AAA mode. So one of the precaution or caution we should take is that do not use the command unless you are prepared to configure AAA authentication. Doing so could force Tenet users to authenticate with a username even if no username database or authentication method is configured. So it's only when you want to configure that you begin to do this. Okay, and how to do that? You just say in your command line interface, you write router 1 config hashtag AAA new model. Once you put AAA dash new model, then it will enable AAA authentication. Now we go this configuring the authentication. The first step, like we say router 1 config hashtag AAA authentication, type default, list name, the method 1 to all the way method 4. Method 1 to method 4. Okay, so we are using all the 4 methods. So this is what you type in your command line interface. First, you see the authentication type. We have the login, the enable, the PPP for the PPP, ARAP, and ASI. Then, 2, we have the list type. We have the default name list. 3, we have the method, the local, enable, line, group TACAX, and group radius, Kerberos. Okay, these are the methods that you have that you want to use. Then method 1 and 2 put together. Therefore, you have local, enable, line, group TACAX, group radius, and Kerberos. Okay, so this is what once you type in this command, and then we're good to go. Is that okay? Now, the next is to specify which type of authentication you want to configure. Which type of authentication? Because there are many things to configure. You want to configure the login, or you want to configure the enable, or you want to configure the PPP, or you want to configure the ARAP, or you want to configure the NASI. So which type do you want to configure? Which type of authentication? So that's what we mean by authentication type. Which one do you want to configure? You must specify login. So you must, that's where we have here. Here, what you're going to write under this type when you're doing your programming or when you're configuring this, you must put the type. Here, I put login here. So which means hashtag authentication login default. Then we'll put our name list. We'll talk about the name list and the methods soon. So here you put the type of authentication. Is it login you want to authenticate? Is it enable you want to authenticate? Is it PPP you want to authenticate? You must put what you are authenticating here. Then the next step is the list type. Is the list type default name list? The list type. Okay. The next step is so we say default method list is automatically applied to all the interface if no other method list is defined. If there is no any other method list that has been defined, then the default list will automatically be applied to all the interfaces. Name list must be applied to a specific interface before any of the defined authentication method will be performed. So you must apply the name list first before you apply all the authentication that you want to do. Before you perform any authentication that you want to do, you have to apply the name list first. Okay? Okay. So here we have to enter the default name list. Then after that, we move to the methods. We move to the method. Method lists the type of authentication to be performed. What type? Is it local? Is it enable? Is it line? Is it group TACAX? Is it group TACAX plus? Or is it group radius? Or is it Kerberos? So you must say which of the method you're going to use. Is it method 1? You see what is in method 1, or is it method 1 to 4? Method 1, 2, 3, 4. Which of them you're going to use? So they must be specified. So we say method lists types of authentication to be performed and the sequence. So not only the type, the sequence with which you want to perform them. The type you want to do and the sequence. Okay, that you will follow to perform them. In which they will be performed. Now, a good example is the predefined password, local, enable, or line. Which one? The consulting TACAX plus and radius or Kerberos servers. So, which one are you configuring for TACAX plus radius? So, all of this must be defined. So, order this configuration. Now, configure authentication. So, once we write router config hashtag AA authentication login. See, login here. we put login, other type, login. Name list, method 1 to 4. Now let's take a look at the command. Default, we say uses the listed authentication method that follows this keyword as the default list of the method when a user logs in. Name list, they are the character string used to name the list of authentication method activated when a user logs in. Method 1 to 4, it identifies the list of the methods that the AAA authentication process will query in the given sequence. So at least one method must be specified. So these are all you need to do. Now, these are the methods, these are the description. Enable is a method, line is a method, local case, none, cache, group radius, group attacks, plus, and so on and so forth. So now let's move on. You can see under the method 1 to 4, you can see enable. Enable uses the enable password for authentication. Line uses the line password for authentication. Local uses the local username database for authentication. Local case uses the case sensitive local username for authentication, and so on and so forth. Okay, now let's move on. Let's move on. We say locks account with excessive failed attempt. So you also configure this, that if someone tries to log into the network many times, you configure the number of times you want, the maximum fail that you want, and then the server has to authorize this router to block the number of successful fail attempts. So here we configure the number of fail attempt that is allowable in order for the user to be blocked. Okay, so in this case, you say in your command line interface, you write router config hashtag AAA local authentication attempt max fail. So maximum failure, you put a number here. If 5, you put 5 here. If 10, you put 10 here. How many times you think failure of an attempt that you want, and in order to block the person, the user that is trying to force himself. Okay, so that's what it is. Number of unsuccessful attempts is the number of unsuccessful authentication attempts before a connection is dropped, before the connection is eventually dropped. Now, locking a user account. This command locks the user account if the authentication fails and the account stays locked until it is cleared by the administrator. So in this case, this one is not to, the first one is to drop after number of failure. This one is to block or lock the account after so many number of failure. Maybe failed attempt is 10, we say lock the account, lock it, okay, till you are cleared by the administrator. Now, configuring local AAA authentication. We add the username and password to the local router database for users that needs administrative access to the router. So, if you need administrative access to a router, your username and password must be added to the local router database. If not, the router will not authenticate you and you'll not be able to log in. Okay. So then again, another thing in configuring the AAA authentication is to enable AAA globally on the router. We have to also enable AAA globally on the router. If not, the router will not be able to do this. And the third thing to do is to configure the AAA parameters on the router. You have to configure the AAA parameters on the router. Then the fourth one is to confirm and troubleshoot the AAA configuration. Now, here is the configuration sample. Router 1, hashtag config terminal. Config means config terminal. Router 1 config hashtag username. So what's your username? JROadmin. Okay. Secret, strong password. That's the secret. Secret means password. Okay. Strong password. That's the password for today's this. Then router 1 config hashtag username. You already know admin. Secret, strong password. Router 1 config hashtag AAA new model. AAA new model. Then router 1 config hashtag AAA authentication login default local case. So you are configuring each of this one now, the new model to enable this AAA, okay, authentication. AAA authentication login default local case. That's case sensitive. Then router 1 config hashtag AAA local authentication attempts maximum fail 10. So if you fail 10 times, then you can block or you can throw the person out. Now, using a name list, a default list or a named list can be defined. A default list is automatically applied to all the interfaces if no any other method of list has been defined or has been applied. Then a named list, so that's for default list, which is normally automatically applied to all interfaces if no any other method of list has been applied or defined. Then a name list must be applied to a specific interface that you want. Is it the VTY? Is it the auxiliary? Is it the cursor? You must define the specific interface that you want before any of the defined authentication method will be performed. So you have to do a name list, meaning name the interfaces that you want, define them before you can do anything. So here is similar. Router 1 config hashtag config terminal. Router 1 config hashtag username. You put the username. Secret means password. Then you put the password. Then router 1 config hashtag username admin secret password. Router 1 config hashtag AAA new model. Router 1 config hashtag authentication login default local case enabled. You must enable this local case, default local case. Then router 1 config hashtag AAA authentication login tenant login local case. Then router 1 config hashtag line VTY, that's virtual terminal 04. Then router 1 config line hashtag login authentication tenant login. So you do all of this, then you have configured the name list, because you put the line VTY04. Okay, so you have to configure a name list so that the system can perform. Display user information. Once you want the router to display the user information, you just put router 1 hashtag show AAA local user log out. Okay, so local user JR admin log time has been given, and then after that you are logged out. Then for show section, you type this command on the command line interface, router 1 hashtag show AAA section. Then to display everything in your AAA, your IP address, your idle time, your call handle, your username, your unique ID, and your session ID and everything. Okay. So same, troubleshooting AAA authentication is the same thing. So all this time, what you just need to type is router 1 hashtag debug AAA. Once you do that, it will troubleshoot AAA. Still on that, router 1 hashtag debug AAA authentication. So if you want the AAA authentication, the first one is to debug AAA. It will give you all the AAA accounting, administrative, AAA, everything on the AAA. Now, if you now say debug router 1 config, router 1 hashtag debug AAA authentication, it will give you all the authenticated date and timing for your AAA. So now let's go to configuring local authentication using CCP. CCP is Cisco Configuration Professional. Okay, that's where apart from using the command line interface, we also use the Cisco Configuration Professional to configure any authentication that we want to carry out. Okay, and then when you are done, you say AAA is disabled by default once you are done, it will be disabled by default in this CCP. So when you come to this CCP, which is your Cisco Configuration Professional, Then you can click on your AAA, and then we move on to to AAA admin. That's to put your username. Put AAA admin. You put your password. After putting your username here, you put your password. You verify. You confirm your password. You put the privilege level. How many privilege level this person should have. Then associate view on the user. Okay. Then you click OK. You just click OK. After that, we move on to we select the group radius, the group TACAX plus, and the group. So you do one at a time. This is for the group radius. You click on the group radius. Okay. Other additional tasks. You click additional tasks. You see all of this. Then you select which of the authentication login you want to use. Is it the group radius or the group TACAX, and so on and so forth, Kebros 5, and so on and so forth. Line, enable, is the enable you want to do, so you must specify, and then you click OK. Okay, now let's go to another section of this class, which is implementing server-based authentication, server-based AAA authentication. So to implement server-based AAA authentication, these are the following things that we should do. Server-based solution, first and foremost, look at this. These are all the server. We have the Cisco Secure ACS for Windows server. This is for Windows, and this is for Solution Engine. Okay, ACS Solution Engine, and this is Cisco Secure ACS Express. Okay, so this is the remote user or client. Now the user establishes a connection with the router. The user use step 1 to establish connection with the router. Then the router prompts the user for a username and password. So that's step 2. He asks you for a username and password. Okay. And then once you give the username and password, the router passes the username and password to the Cisco Secure ACN server or NG. It passes this username and password to the ACN server or the NG, pass them to the. Then step 4, the Cisco Secure ACN authenticate the user. The Secure ACS, we authenticate the user. The user is authorized to access the router administrative access, or the network based on information in the Cisco ACS database. So you only be granted access based these servers will grant you access based on your privileges that has been created for you. Is that okay? So this is server-based solution. Then let's talk about the TACAX and the radius, which are protocols that are used for authentication and accounting, which are used for the triple A's, which are used for the triple A's. Now, first and foremost, we say the Cisco ACS family support the terminal, which is TACAX Plus, Terminal Access Control Server Plus, TACAX Plus, and this Cisco ACS family also support the Radius protocol, which is the remote dial-in use service. Okay, so this protocol, once the server grant an access, then this protocol will be able to help you to communicate with this other side, the servers. Is that okay? So we say the TACAX Plus and Radius protocols, they used to communicate between the clients and the AAA security servers. So these protocols, the TACAX Plus and the Radius, they help to communicate between these clients and these servers. Okay, now let's move on. TACAX Plus and Radius, these are protocols. Remember, they are protocols that are used by AAAs. Both protocols can be used to communicate between client and AAA servers. That's both TACAX Plus and Radius. Another advantage or another point about these two is that the TACAX Plus is considered to be more secure protocol because all the exchanges are encrypted. All the exchanges or messages or all the transmission, all the data, all the packets, they are encrypted. But in the case of Radius, it's only the password that is encrypted. Radius only encrypt the password, then it will leave the other message, every other thing unencrypted. So it does not encrypt your username, your account informations, or any other information carried on the Radius message. So since we say Taka Plus is so good because it can authenticate or encrypt all your messages, then let's take a look at the Taka Plus itself because of this unique advantage. So Taka Plus is a Cisco protocol that provides separate AAA services, and it's used for supporting the AAA services to provide flexibility in implementation because it's possible to use Taka Plus for authorization and accounting while using another for authentication. So we can use Taka Plus for authorization and accounting, and we can use another Taka Plus for authentication. So here is the catch. Let's take a look at it. The first step is that the client connects with the router. The second step is that the router will prompt for username prompt. Okay. Then the username, after connection, meaning you've given your username and password, your username, you're giving it to the router. The router will ask the server, do you recognize this username? Once the server says yes, then it will move to the next step. You will inform this person to give the username, to give your username. Okay, because once you establish connection, the router already asked the ACN, access control server, that give me this person's username. Then the router will now ask you, once he has it, he will ask you to give. So when you give, to compare whether it's same. Okay? You now give here, you give your username. You say JRO admin, that's your username. Then the router will still forward it to the admin, and sorry, to the server. Is it JRO correct? Yeah. Once it's correct, then it will prompt you for password. The router will prompt the server for password of this same person. Okay, and then he will ask you. Once he receives the reply from the ACS server, then the router will now ask you as the individual to give your password. Once you give your password, then the router will verify the password. You forward the password, and then you get a feedback, accept or reject. Okay, if the password is recognized by this server, it will be accepted. If not, it will be rejected. So you cannot have access if it's rejected. So this is TACACS authentication. This is how authentication takes place in the case of TACACS Plus. Now let's talk about Radius authentication. Radius was developed by Livingston Enterprise, right? And it's an open IETF standard for AAA protocol for applications such as your network access and IP mobility. Okay. Now, Radius is currently defined by RFC 2865, 2866, 2867, 2868. Okay, so Radius is defined by these RFCs. Okay, now the Radius protocol hides password during transmission. It encrypts it. That's the meaning of it hides it. It hides it. It encrypts the password during transmission, but the rest of the packet is sent in plain text. It does not hide it. Radius combine the authentication and authorization as one process, or like the TACACS. Okay, TACACS carry authentication separate, but authorization and accounting puts them together for TACACS. But for Radius, Radius combines authentication and authorization as one process, which means that when a user is authenticated, that user is also authorized. because it has been combined as one process, other radius. Once a user is authenticated, then that same user has also been authorized. Radius uses UDP, unlike TACACS that uses TCP. Radius uses UDP ports 1645 and 8012. Radius use the UDP ports 1645 and 8012 for authentication of UDP ports 1646 or 8030 for accounting. So this one for authentication 1645 or 8012 for authentication, and for accounting use the UDP port 1646 and 8030 for accounting. Both of these for accounting. Now here is the catch. First, the router, see, the router prompt you for your username. Then you give your username JROadmin, and then the next thing the router forward the JRO. Then the router again asks you, because it's doing it one time, both authentication and authorization. So they ask you for password before you even forward to the server. They ask you for the password, and then you give the password. And once you give them, you forward both your username and password to the server, and the server access means accept. Then if accept, you are granted access. If not, you are denied. Radius authentication. Radius is widely used by voice over IP service provider because it passes the login credentials of a section initiation protocol SIP, section initiation protocol endpoint, such as the broadband phones, to a SIP registrar using the digest authentication, and then to a radius server using radius. Okay. However, you see the diameter protocol is being planned. It's been developed already, planned, and is being used to replace the radius. The diameter uses a new transport protocol called the Stream Control Transmission Protocol, SCTP, or what we call the TCP instead of UDP. So this diameter protocol, unlike the radius protocol, the diameter protocol now uses TCP instead of UDP. Tax versus radius. Okay, the advantage and disadvantage, which is better, what is for functionality. TACACS Plus separate the AAA according to AAA architecture, allowing modularities of the security server implementation. But the radius combine the authentication and authorization, right? Then another one to look at is their standard. For TACACS Plus, mostly Cisco supported. For radius is Oppo RFC standard. Transport protocol. For TACACS Plus, you use TCP port 49, and for radius, you use UDP port 1645 or 1812 for authentication, and then it uses UDP port 1646 or 1830 for accounting. Therefore, CHAP bidirectional, the TACACS Plus is bidirectional challenge and response. But for radius is unidirectional. For protocol support, for TACACS Plus is multi-protocol support for multi-protocol use. Then for radius, no ARA, no net boot. Okay, confidentiality, entire packet is encrypted for TACACS Plus, and for radius, it's only the password that is encrypted. For customization, TACACS Plus provides authorization of router commands on a per user per group basis. And then why the radius has no option to authorize router commands. There on accounting, the TACACS Plus is limited and the radius is very extensive in accounting. Now Cisco ACS. ACS is access control server. Now let's take a look at the Cisco ACS. Many enterprise level authentication servers are on the market today, right? There's so many now. Some of them are the Funks steel belted radius server that you can find in the market. Some of them are the Livingstone's Enterprises Radius Authentication Billing Manager server. Some of them that you can find in the market includes the Merit Networks Radius. And then the very popular one is the Cisco Secure ACS for Windows servers. Okay, so you can find all of this in the market in case you want to buy. I think there are even more now recently. In case you want to buy Cisco Secure ACS, then you want to buy ACS. Okay, now then we say the Cisco ACS is a single solution that offers AAA services using Takas Plus or Radius. Okay, now let's move on. Cisco Secure ACS option. We have different options in the market which you can find. Now, Cisco Secure ACS, if you click on the home, you see the user setup, group setup, shared profile. You see the one that network configuration. You see, this is what you click if you want to configure the network. System configuration, if you want to configure the entire system. Interface configuration, if you want to configure specific interface. This is what we normally use. And like you want to configure line or like VTY or anything you want to go. Admin control, administrative control, external user database, and so on and so forth. So this is how it looks. So here on the home, all you just need, for example, you click on the network configuration, this one, network configuration. If you click on this network configuration, it brings you to this place. Then you add entries. You click on add entries. Once you click on add the entries, then you will it will take you here. Add a AAA client. You put all the client details. Router what? AAA, the IP address, whatever you key them, Takas Plus, you select Takas Plus because that's what you want to configure. And then external, you can also click on the external, if you want to still on the configuration, external user database. And then when you click on the external user database, it brings you to this interface. And then you click on any specific, the window database and any specific that you want to configure. You click on it and then you're here. Where you click on configure, not delete, configure. When you click on configure, window user database configuration will pop up, and then it say this permission, and the window callback, and so on and so forth. And then you begin to start your configuration. The group setup. You click on group setup, then go to setting, and click on setting. Then it brings you to the group setup, where you have to put in everything that you're configuring in that network. And then user setup. When you click on add, then it brings you to user setup, and you key in all the user details that you want to key in, and then you click OK. So you can use this link to do a demo. Okay, click on this link in this place to do a demo for ACS version 5. Now let's go to configure Cisco server-based AAA authentication. What you need to do, you go to your command line interface configuration. These are the steps you need to follow. Number 1, enable AAA. How to do that? You write in your command line interface AAA new mode there. Then number 2 is to configure the security protocol parameters. What do you do that? You say server IP address and key. So you put the IP address and the key. Key is the password. Then number 3, define the authentication method list. Usually you just say AAA authentication. Type AAA authentication. Number 4, apply the method list to a particular interface or line. This is only if it is required. Then optionally configured authentication using the global command AAA authorization. We configure the authorization, using the global command by just typing in the command line interface AAA authorization. Then number 6, optionally you can configure the accounting using the global command by saying AAA accounting. Okay, we're going to look at each of this one. Now, server-based AAA authentication specify the location of the AAA server that will provide AAA services. Also, configure the encryption key needed to encrypt the data transfer between the network system, network access server, and the Cisco secure access. Okay, so here are some AAA configuration commands, okay, that you can type for IP address, for the key, and so on and so forth. Okay, now let's go to configuring the AAA server parameters. All you need to do here is your router. Here is the IP address of this IS server. This is the TACAX Plus NG solution, solution NG, sorry, and it's TACA Plus, and so this is Cisco ACS window for radius. Now what you need to do is just to type your command in your command line interface. Router 1 config AAA new model there. Router 1 config hashtag TACAX server host. You put the IP address and then single connection. Then you do it again, TACAX server key, TACAX, you put the password there. Router 1 config hashtag radius server host. You're doing for TACAX Plus and for radius. Same thing you did here, you do here. Okay, you're configuring for both of them. So define method list. The method list say router 1 config hashtag AAA authentication login default. So enable group Kerberos 5, Kerberos 10, and so on and so forth. So you configure all this one. Then another thing, router 1 config hashtag authentication login default group. After login default, then you enter for login default group. After all the login default group, TACAX, here you talk about the radius and the TACAX Plus host. After that, the next one is to configure router 1 configure hashtag AAA authentication login default group again. Okay, so after that, the job is done for that. AAA authentication command, these are some of the commands. Router 1 config hashtag AAA authentication login default group TACAX Plus group radius local case. So once you enter this, then you've done for all at once. Okay. Configuring the AAA server. Now, same thing like we mentioned, but here you just mentioned the server. So we say AAA new model, router 1 configure hashtag AAA new model. And then router 1 config hashtag TACAX server host, you put the IP address, single connection. TACAX server key, you put the TACAX Plus and the password. Then router 1 config hashtag radius server, you put the IP address, radius. Then router 1 config hashtag radius server key, radius password, you put the radius password. Then router 1 config hashtag AAA authentication login default group TACAX Plus, the group radius local case. Then that is done. Now troubleshooting, how do you troubleshoot? It's just to put on your command line interface router 1 hashtag debug AAA authentication. It will bring out everything. If there's fault, if there's error, it will display everything. So if you want for TACAX, you say router 1 hashtag debug TACAX. If you want, it will show you all the protocol, accounting, authentication, authorization, and the packets, and with TACAX Plus. Okay. Then if you want for radius, router 1 hashtag debug radius. Once you put that, it will show you everything about the radius. Okay. So, and so on and so forth. So this is if you are using server-based AAA CCP, the Cisco Configuration Professional, if you're using that, you just put TACAX Plus in the Cisco Configuration Professional interface. Put the TACAX Plus, and then you put the IP address, you put the password, and then it takes you to, then you click on add to add the TACAX Plus and all the hosts in the TACAX Plus that you need to add. You click on them, and then you are in. And then you put the detailed information of the TACAX Plus. How many attempts in order to time out, 10 attempts in order to time out, or 10 minutes in order to time out the system. So you key all this thing in, and then you move on. Okay. Now let's go to server-based authorization. Server-based authorization. So authorization, like we said, is used to limit the services available to any given user, to limit the services a user has in a system. That's what authorization is used for. Router uses the user's profile information located either in the local user database or in the security server to configure the user section. Okay, so all you need to do is to router one configure hashtag AAA authorization, type in the default name list, method, everything that we've done before. It's just that instead of authentication, we put authorization in this regard. Is that okay? Everything that we've done before. See the client with the admin name, you say show version, and then the server will see command the authorization for the router will ask the server to command the authorization for the user JRO admin by you typing the show version command, and then once the server accepts, the router will display show version to the admin, which displays to show version. Then the admin will configure the terminal. Once he finishes the configuration, the router will send everything to the server, and then the server will either reject or accept. But if you reject, do not permit. Okay, if you reject, do not permit. You don't have this. Okay, so that's it. Configuring authorization type. These are the various types you have. But here, configuring authorization is the same thing like I said for authentication. We do the same thing, but anywhere we put authentication, here we have to put authorization here. Okay, here. Router 1 config hashtag AAA authorization, execute default group TACAX plus. Router 1 config hashtag AAA authorization, network default group TACAX plus. So before now, this is the one you've done for, you've configured for authentication. Now you are authorizing, so you have to add. You have to add, okay? Don't be bothering, oh, why we're doing authorization, why do we now have authentication? You know the authentication command you've entered in the command line interface already. So now you are just continuing. You are now authorizing. You are typing the authorization command, and then you also put the line, command line, the virtual terminal 04, and then the login authentication, tenants login, everything you put here. Is that okay? So it's the same thing like we said just now. Let's just move on. Now let's go to server-based accounting. For server-based accounting, like we said, accounting defines the way accounting will be performed and the sequence in which they will be performed. What is being done and what is recorded and what will be reported, and the sequence. So name list is enabled to designate a particular security protocol to be used on these specific lines and interfaces for the accounting services that is being provided. Now, however, we say everything is the same, or just that where we used to write AAA authentication or AAA authorization, we just put AAA accounting. Router 1 config hashtag AAA accounting, the same, the type, you put your type, what type of type you're using, and then you put your default name list, name record, and methods, and so on and so forth. Everything is same, like looking at your Router 1 config hashtag AAA accounting, and then Router 1 config hashtag AAA accounting execute, Router 1 config hashtag AAA accounting execute default, Router 1 config hashtag AAA accounting execute default start stop, Router 1 config accounting execute default start stop group. So all of this command you have to key in, all of this in your command line interface. So if you look at the configuring the accounting, you see what is basic. We've done the authentication configuration, we've done the authorization configuration. Now this for the accounting. Router 1 config hashtag AAA accounting execute start stop group TACAX plus. Router 1 you do for TACAX plus. Router 1 config hashtag AAA accounting network start stop group TACAX plus. So and then you put every other thing. So you enter for the account. So with this we come to the end of our today's class. Thank you for joining us.